Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Business Building Rockstar Show. This is a special additional episode that I decided to bring to you as a sort of bonus because I really was inspired and wanted to share a story about somebody who has hugely impacted my life and through an organization that he founded. And so this is a little bit different than usual. But what happened that inspired this, and I actually talk about it in the episode with Dave Smith, but I'll tell you right up front that Dave Smith from Special Love Incorporated had sent out an email letting people who were on their list know that the founder of the organization, Tom Baker, had passed on. And this was a couple weeks ago at time of recording. And I was just really moved. It really hit me hard, a lot harder than I expected it would. And Tom Baker, he was somebody who really left a legacy. And so after getting that message, I started thinking about all the things I'd like to say and share about how Tom showed up in the world and the lives that he changed and the impact that he's made. I was going to do a Facebook Live, but I wanted to be respectful as well of, the grief that the family was going through. And I was waiting to hear back before doing that. And by the time I got word back from Dave with the go ahead and do it, it also crossed my mind that I thought, you know what? I think sharing where they're at right now and what the vision for Special Love moving forward could be really valuable. And also, Dave has such an interesting story about how he got involved in Special Love. And so what I asked was if I could interview him about it. So I just wrapped up the interview and I've decided that I'm going to actually release the video on Facebook. It's also going to be in our listeners lounge. And if you want to see it there, but I'm going to release the video right away because I think that it's really inspiring and impactful for people who either are involved already with Special Love or who would like to become involved with Special Love, or maybe people who don't even know a support like this exists. So with that, I decided I'm also going to just put this out as a special bonus episode rather than making it wait until it was originally supposed to air. So with that, before I introduce Dave Smith, I want to read you the obituary that was shared on January 12th when Tom passed away so that you understand who this person is I'm speaking about and kind of what the premise is for this interview. So Tom Carr Baker was born in 1938 in Winchester, Virginia, to the late Mary Sullivan Baker and Charles B. Baker. He graduated in 1956 from Handley High School, where he was president of his class. He went on to attend Virginia Tech, graduating in 1960 with a degree in electrical engineering. On August 5th, 1961, Tom married Sheila Fries, his high school sweetheart. He worked for Westinghouse, doing electrical work for the submarine USS Ethan Allen. Tom and Sheila returned to Winchester in 1963, working with his father in the electrical contracting firm Baker and Anderson. A few years after the death of his father, Tom moved into real estate development, building residential homes. He later established storage and warehouse units around Winchester. Tom sold his warehouse business in 1996 and was able to retire. However, in November of 1976, Tom and Sheila lost their eldest daughter, Julie, from lymphoma. A few years after Julie's passing, Sheila found a magazine article about a man in New York State who started a camp for his daughter with cancer after she was turned down to attend regular camp. Tom decided that he wanted to do the same thing for other children with cancer. After Sheila and Tom visited that camp, they found a location to have a camp locally and secured medical backing. In August of 1983, the first Camp Fantastic was held at the 4-H Center in Front Royal, Virginia, with 30 children. Today, there are over 100 children with cancer attending camp each summer, along with a separate camp experience for brothers and sisters. Later, Tom and Sheila donated their first home and the land that it was on to create the Youth Development Center for the youth of the Winchester area. In the following years, Tom was awarded many special medals and awards for his accomplishments, including one of the Washingtonians of the Year and other prized local awards. In addition, Tom was a member of the Rotary Club for over 45 years, serving 1 year as president. In addition to his daughter, Tom was preceded in death by his parents and his brother, Reggie. Besides Sheila, his wife of 56 years, Tom is survived by his son, Mark Baker of Glen Allen, Virginia, and his daughter, Katie Wooten of Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina. his 8 wonderful grandchildren, as well as his sister, Betsy, and 4 nephews and nieces. So this camp that Tom created was actually a big part of my life. So my younger brother had cancer. I believe he was diagnosed in 1986, if I remember correctly. And we became involved with Camp Fantastic very shortly after diagnosis. And it was an organization that provided such support at a time where, it can only be devastating. I don't know what other word to use when your child gets ill. So I can only imagine it was devastating to my parents. It definitely changed our life and the way normal looked in our day to day. It definitely changed the life for my brother, and it definitely changed my life. And so having this organization really provided so many foundational supports that personally I needed growing up. And I'm sure provided the rest of my family with supports they needed as well. And so throughout my lifetime, I can always go back to points in my childhood where there were profound things that happened or profound learnings or experiences that I still value and hold dear today and that have helped shape me into the person who I am. And so my life was in large part, shaped and formed in who I am and how I show up. And my belief system was in large part formed by this vision that Tom Baker had. So I just really wanted to share this from a personal space and also to let people know who might not know that there are supports for whatever they're going through. There are people who are creating these things and maybe you are creating these things. And maybe one day you will be creating these things based on something that has had a profound impact on you. And so I would love for Tom's legacy to live on and inspire others. And I'm happy to share it with you on this podcast. So with that, let me introduce Dave Smith. Dave Smith is the CEO of Special Love, a Mid-Atlantic charity for children with cancer and their families. Dave has helped run Special Love's hallmark program, Camp Fantastic, for most of its 35-year existence. Camp Fantastic and all of Special Love's programs give young pediatric cancer patients and their siblings the chance to be normal kids, and their parents with the opportunity to meet and share resources with other pediatric oncology families. Dave is also the past president of the Children's Oncology Camping Association International and has mentored many other cancer camps. He's an avid musician and loves to interact with his campers and their families. So without further ado, here is my interview with Dave Smith. Welcome, Dave Smith, CEO of Special Love Incorporated. I'm super, super excited to have you here. We chatted a little bit before we hit record, and you have personally been a part of my life since I was a child, and the organization has, and it's had so much of a profound effect on me. And I get interviewed all the time. And oftentimes when people want to talk about backstory and kind of when you started doing what you do and how did you learn to coach, and so much of my own personal history ties back to Camp Fantastic and Special Love Incorporated. So I'm super excited to have you here with us on the Business Building Rockstar Show so that we can really highlight what Special Love is and what the mission is and your journey, because you've been there like 30 years now. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Long time no see.
I know, right? So let's talk about Tom. So what happened that kind of reconnected us, or what inspired me to invite you to come on the show, is that recently Tom Baker, who was the founder of Camp Fantastic and Special Love, passed on. And so you had sent out an email and shared, the eulogy and your own personal story with Special Love. And I thought that this is a great platform to share about Special Love and how it started and who Tom Baker was and what it's about and how you got involved. So I'm just going to turn it over to you from here. If you can just give us a bit of that story about who was Tom and Sheila, and how did this all begin?
Sure. Well, Tom Baker and his wife Sheila live here in Winchester, Virginia. And it was back when I was 19 years old. working at the 4-H Center in Front Royal as a summer camp counselor while I was in college that I met Tom and Sheila for the first time. They basically walked in late August, just after we'd finished 4-H camp, and pretty much unannounced came in and asked if they could talk to someone about starting a camp. And so John Dooley was the director of the 4-H Center at that time and my summer boss. And so he called me into the meeting only because I was the last summer staff person still there. My college started the latest of anyone. So he called me into that meeting, and Tom and Sheila shared that their daughter, Julie, had passed away in 1976 from lymphoma. And at the time that she was treated, she was only treated for a year, and that was at the National Cancer Institute. And she didn't get the opportunity to go to camp or do kind of summer activities because, like a lot of children who are on treatment, especially back in those days, she was sequestered and pretty much out of the public eye for most of her illness. So what they had come across a camp in upper state New York that only dealt with kids with cancer. And it was kind of an epiphany for them. In fact, Tom later said it was the closest thing he's ever had to a true calling, that they needed to start a program like this in the DC area. So they walked into the 4-H Center, sight unseen, and asked John if he could do a camp similar to the 4-H camps that we were already running, but do it for kids with cancer. And so John, as fate would have it, had just hours before hung up the phone with another gentleman who wanted to run a special needs camp, but didn't have the resources and it wasn't going to work out. So John was already primed for the ask. And when the Bakers just came in unannounced and made that pledge, John said, of course, we can do that. I was already ready to do that. So John and Tom went to the head of the National Cancer Institute at the time, Phil Pizzo, and said, how hard would it be for your medical staff to see these kids and treat them while they were at camp? And so the NCI did something that was unheard of at the time and unheard of even now. They enrolled every kid who came for the week of Camp Fantastic as an NIH patient just for that week, because that gave them the malpractice insurance and the legal right to treat these kids with the same chemotherapy that they were taking at home. And what the significance of that is that the kids could get their chemotherapy at camp, and they didn't have to either be transferred back and forth to a hospital, or they didn't have to basically sit at home and pass on camp because they were too sick. They could get treated at camp as if they were at the hospital and then go back to having a normal camp activity in between treatments. And so that was unheard of at the time. And still, even with almost 200 cancer camps around the world, there are very few that can handle kids with the acuity that Special Love and Camp Fantastic is able to handle. And that was our first week-long camp, Camp Fantastic. And we had 29 kids that first year, and we have now see about 260 families a year through all of our programs. And of course, one of those families were the Hollands.
One of them were. So that was in 1983 was your first camp, is that correct?
Our first week of Fantastic was 83. It was almost a year to the day after Tom and Sheila walked into the 4-H Center. And so they raised enough money to run that 1 week of Camp Fantastic. But they knew right away that the kids were not going to be happy with waiting 51 weeks to see each other again. And plus, they knew that one of the reasons why they only got 29 kids that first year was because there were parents who couldn't even fathom the idea of letting go of their child for a week when they hadn't been out of the hospital for a year. And so we realized that in order for the parents to have a trust in where their kids were going to end up for camp, we needed to have family camps over the weekends so that moms and dads and siblings could also see what this was all about. And they could meet some of the staff and, develop some trust and some assurance that their kids would be okay while they were gone for a week alone. And that's where Special Love was the 501c3 that the Bakers founded as not only a fundraising arm, but also as an umbrella for all of the programs to fit under. And so Special Love now runs about 14 programs a year, most of them for patients or patients and families, but 2 of them are just for siblings, and they're called BRASS, which stands for Brothers and Sisters. And Nicole, even you might not have known that originally it was called Top Brass because the idea was siblings are just as important, and they are top brass, and they deserve to be treated as well and loved as much as their sick brother or sister.
I do remember that because I was at the first Top Brass ever, even though I was too young. I don't know if it was you that made the exception or somebody made the exception for me to come, even though I was a year too young for the camp.
I probably didn't have that kind of clout, so... No, I'm glad we did because, your family participated not only in Camp Fantastic and Brass, but also in our family weekends. In fact, I can still picture the bright blue snowsuit that your dad wore to ski, and it had fluorescent stripes on it because I think those were all in fashion back then. So at our family's camps, I can still remember your dad skiing down the hill in his Dayglow ski suit.
Yeah, the jumper. I still remember that too. So That's awesome. Yeah. So Canaan Valley, and I mean, you have YAC, the young adults with cancer. So after they are finished with Camp Fantastic, then they have that support. Yeah.
That's right. In fact, we found that a lot of the kids left the week of Camp Fantastic and had aged out, and yet their need was just as great to be around others who understood what they were going through. And so YAC, as you said, YAC stands for Young Adults with Cancer. And our YAC weekend is for 18 to 25-year-olds. And not just for the kids who've been to camp and, want to continue those ties, but also for young adults who are new to the whole world and the cancer world, and they want to meet other young adults.
Amazing. I mean, we could talk about Camp Fantastic all day long. I love what you guys do. It's life-changing for everybody involved. But what I'd love to talk about for a little bit is how it changed your life. Because when you were 19 years old and you were a 4-H camp counselor and a college student, had you ever had any experience with children with cancer before?
Never. In fact, by the time I met the Bakers, I only had about 2 years of experience with kids at all. I think that was as much due to John Dooley, even before the Bakers walked in the door. John, I guess put his faith in me that I would be able to handle kids and, I guess come out of my shell in order to let them have fun at camp. And so John was the first person who really invested in me. And that was based on simply the knowledge. He knew my parents because they both worked at Alderson Broaddus College, which is now Alderson Broaddus University in West Virginia. That's my alma mater. And my parents and John were on the staff and faculty. And so John got to know me growing up. And I think he saw something in me in terms of my ability to have fun with kids and kind of let my hair down. And so it was only because of John's faith in me that he brought me down to the 4-H Center in Front Royal back in 1982. And it was at the end of that very first summer when the Bakers walked in. And I wish I could tell you that by then I had already learned enough and had gained enough confidence that I was able to help lead that discussion and the planning for Camp Fantastic. And, that I played a real pivotal role. But the fact is, I barely remember that conversation. I do remember thinking, this is going to be a challenge. But on the other hand, what they wanted to do was create a normal childhood experience. And of course, that's what 4-H camp did. We gave camp experiences every week for 9 weeks of the summer. So we didn't really have to change much. We just needed to bring in the medical staffing and to make sure that our volunteer staffing was aware of what extra challenges there would be. And I obviously can relate to what it was like to do that for the very first time, because when I was 19, they came in the door and ready or not, I had no idea what to expect. In fact, I still vividly remember lying on the bottom bunk while one of my campers lay above me, and his breathing was so loud from, I guess, his medication really had him ultra relaxed, but his breathing was so loud that I just lay under there terrified of what would happen if it stopped. And it's kind of a morbid story, although he was fine. And I think he went on to survive his cancer, but I was just petrified that first summer what it was going to be like to be responsible for another child's life. And little did I realize that that's what the doctors and nurses were for. I had nothing to do with the child's health, only his emotional well-being. And so one of the first things I try to do with new staff is to assuage their fears and assure them that you're here to just provide them with fun and a normal week of camp. The doctors and the nurses will make sure they stay alive through the end of the camp, which is, of course, an exaggeration. Our kids are fine. In fact, we've never lost a child at camp. I think for most people, when they hear children with cancer, they automatically throw the word terminal in there half the time, which is grossly inaccurate, because the national average now is about 78% of the kids will survive beyond 5 years of their diagnosis. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to have long-term late effects or that the chemotherapy itself might actually kill them eventually, but it's still much better than what most people would realize.
Yeah. And I want to actually touch on this and dig in a little bit, because things are certainly different now than they were back in the 80s. We're constantly, healthcare is improving and research is improving and changing and all that. But again, going back to when you started and you were just a kid yourself, and here's these kids who are fragile, and that's great that there's the medical professionals to take care of them, but they're also dealing with things that most adults don't deal with, right? And you had to, you're dealing also with kids that do die. I mean, that was a big marker of my life growing up, is that I would make friends at Camp Fantastic. Debbie Van Coverden. Gosh, I have so many faces and can't think of names right now. Amy, so many names that are escaping me at the moment. But I mean, you had these kids, you had a relationship with these kids, you played with these kids, you knew these kids, you saw these kids and these families over the years. And what was that like for you when you first started realizing that, okay, this was camp and this was fun, and now this kid's not coming back? And how did you deal with that? And how have you grown, I guess, personally through that? And to now 30 years later, I think we all see things through different lenses, but can you talk about how you were able to stand in support of the children and families with that reality?
Sure. I mean, like anybody else, you hate to lose people. And I think at the time, like a lot of young people, I had a pretty naive worldview when it came to not only, I guess, children and life expectancy and so on, but even, my faith, I would say, was pretty, simplistic. And so, it did lead to some rough days when we'd get the news that a child had passed away, or even that a child was in palliative care because they couldn't treat them anymore. And so, I'll be honest, that would be the downside. Now, that comprises so small a portion of the day-to-day work that we do. And of course, we're not in the hospital, so we're not seeing the kids when they are at their sickest. And frankly, there are kids who come into camp who are considered acutely ill, but once they get into camp, they're so eager to have fun that you'd never know it. In fact, I have had people come and say, well, where are the sick kids? Because I see all these kids running around crazy, but I'm not sure where the sick kids are. And so it's very easy to forget that some of them are very ill. But again, camp brings out the life in them. And so it's very easy to forget, that some of them are dealing with acute illness. Now, I will say that I still remember during my job interview when they hired me in 87. I was a volunteer from 83 on, but they hired me in 87. And one of the questions they asked in my interview was, what do you think will lead you away from this job? Or, what do you see being, I guess, the reason for you that you would leave? And of course, it was only the second job I'd ever had. And the first job was working as an admissions counselor for the college I went to, so that was like being paid to go to the same college. So I had no work experience, and I couldn't imagine, I didn't realize I was going to leave this job. But I said, I suppose if I ever did, it would be because I'd lost my connection to the kids, that it didn't feel like, I wasn't getting the same thing out of it that I always had. Well, little did I know that, 10 years later, when I became a parent and had the first of 3 boys, that my connection to the kids didn't diminish, but my connection to the parents exploded. I mean, I was drawn to the parents immediately as soon as I became a parent. And so now I get as much, I guess, satisfaction is not the right word, because sometimes it's a very tough situation, but I feel it strongly about my connection to the parents that we deal with as I do to the kids now. But that means I have more passion, not less, because now I'm drawn to the kids and to the parents. And frankly, that was when it got harder to lose a child. It was one thing when you lost the child and you had no connection to the parents. But now that I'm so connected to the parents, on that rare occasion when we do lose a camper, I just can't fathom what the parents are going through. I mean, hopefully never will. But on the other hand, I have met some incredibly strong parents who they got through because they had to. People, I've had parents say that people ask, how do you do it? Well, I didn't have a choice. You do what you have to do to get through it. And so anyway, that's definitely, that the rare funeral that I go to for a child is heart wrenching. And there've been some real down days, but frankly, it just kind of renews my commitment to making sure that the kids we do see continue to have a wonderful time. And I think, as I said, I alluded to the fact that, your faith growing up is usually based on what mom or dad told you or what the preacher told you. And I think once you get out into the trenches with families who are going through this experience, your spirituality becomes a little more broadened, because you realize that there are no easy answers to why kids get cancer or why children die of cancer. And I don't think there's supposed to be any. I think we're basically put here to connect to each other. And when we see people going through such a challenging and often horrific time, the fact that we want to help and are drawn to them, I think that's the whole point. And so, I don't know, my spirituality, I like to think it's not I wouldn't say I have the answers, but I'm very much more at peace with why I'm here and why these families and I, need each other, frankly.
I love it. And I have to say, mom, dad, whoever, that normally does influence children the most, again, for me personally, my spirituality was most influenced by Camp Fantastic, because I guess from, the brother and sister, or the sisters point of view, it was like, it's so crazy too, like just talking to you now, because I'm like, so 87, you were like, I always thought of you as such an adult.
No, I wasn't much older than you were when you started brass camp. little older. I was legal.
Yeah. But it's like, the energy of the space and the processing and the Vespers and all of that, the way that I guess Tom led and John led and you led and the other natural leaders led and the people who'd been there and been through it, it was like such a safe space and an accepting space, and where everybody can just let their guard down and show up with all their gunk. And it's like, it's not a place where there's judgment, and it's not a place either where I, at least from my perspective as a kid growing up there, and what I carry to this day is it was never a space I ever saw victims, ever. I never saw, woe is me, this is happening to me, or because anytime that came up for people, what I registered and attempted to emulate in my own service to others was that this is an is. So how do we move through this? How do we not just cope, but really thrive in the circumstances? How do we turn it around? Because as we know, we can focus on what's wrong and we get more of what's wrong, or we can focus on what's right. And that's what I love about with Camp Fantastic and the experiences that you guys create is it's a what's right kind of attitude, acknowledging what is while also bringing in, wait a minute, why can't you do this? Why can't you go up in a hot air balloon? Why can't you go to camp? Why can't you ride horses? Why can't you dress up like Kiss and, party on?
Oh, I agree. And I think that's one reason why people ask if I have any pet peeves. And one of them is whining, because I think I've met so many kids and families who are going through stuff that most of us would never want to go through. And yet they don't complain. They just, they knuckle down and go through it. And I think that's something that only until you've faced adversity do you learn how to basically face adversity. The rest of the time you blow things up that have don't deserve to be considered adversity. You're late to work because of traffic, or the person in front of you in the grocery store is taking longer than they should to check out. And so people tend to blow that all up into these crises because they've never faced a real crisis. And you meet some of these families and realize that their priorities are just so much better aligned, and they appreciate the time they have together because they don't take it for granted. And so I go home sometimes and it's hard not to light into my kids for complaining about the littlest things, or, for taking stuff for granted, because I realize that these families don't take anything for granted anymore. And some of them, have faced the worst, and they've still managed to find a silver lining there.
Yes, like Tom and Sheila. And I think it's so amazing, again, that story of how this came to be. And I would love to, in the show notes for this episode, I'll link up your eulogy that you wrote with a little bit more of the backstory, if that's okay.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I think Tom's legacy, obviously it was heartbreaking to lose him, but I think if you look at the legacy left, we should all be that lucky. What a legacy. And to think that, he to me, and you'll see it in the eulogy, that he, if nothing else, what he contributed, and you said it yourself, he gave people the permission to be themselves and to not hold up this guard and, a defense in front of themselves like we're all taught it. I think basically when we become teenagers and suddenly start worrying about what everyone thinks of us. Yeah, he gave you permission to be your true self, because I think that at camp, I tell the staff, this is as close to, most people's idea of heaven or, perfection you're going to see while you're here, because people are going to treat each other nicely just because they're expected to. And they're going to have permission to be themselves and not judge and not be petty. And it's very enlightening to be able to do that.
And even to celebrate. And so it's fun to have this conversation with you for me personally. And I think a lot of my regular listeners are going to take some recognition from this, although I think there's amazing value here for everybody that listens. But some of the things that I regularly get complimented on, if you will, is that non-judgment, is that I show up as who I am unapologetically. And there's been times in my life I haven't, that I've hidden and that I've shrunk down. And when I really come to think about the truth of life and the truth of what I know, it comes back to those teachings that Tom has instilled in everybody who's gone through any of the special love programs. So,
yeah. Well, I think in a way, it's no wonder that we're all fascinated by people in power who fall, great fallings of people in power, because we realize they're human just like we are. And so there's just an innate, I guess, magnetism of uniting with people who are imperfect, because we're all imperfect. And as soon as we admit that, then we begin to make real change and real progress.
Awesome. Totally. So speaking of change, you are kind of shifting your focus now with special love and getting reconnected with the peeps, I believe. Do you want to talk about that? Kind of where things are going for you in your role, and also where things are going with Camp Fantastic or Special Love as a whole?
Sure. Yeah. Well, like any nonprofit, small nonprofit, when you start a small nonprofit, there's usually a personal connection. The founder is usually connected somehow intricately with the cause. And in this case, of course, the Bakers had lost a daughter. So when you start small, there's usually one employee. If you're lucky, there's two, and they do everything. And so everyone has to cross-train and cross-function, and you become a really good generalist. You're generally good at everything, but you don't have the time to really get good at anything, really good at anything. And so, I've been with Special Love for 30 years now. They operated for 5 years just as a volunteer organization. They hired me in 87, and, for good or bad, they haven't figured out a way to get rid of me. And so 30 years later, with 31 years actually in April, I went from doing everything to then focusing on program and fundraising and having someone help with admin. And then we added a program director and a development officer so that I could focus on. At that point, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to focus on. I just kind of made sure that all the fires were put out and that I was still bringing value. Well, as organizations get larger, there's an old saying, you always rise to the level of your own incompetence, or you're promoted to the level of your own incompetence. Or in our case, we just had enough specialists that I had to get better at something. And frankly, administration was never it. I was able to generalize the admin function. And so as we've gotten bigger, I've come to the realization that my passion lies in the campsite, the program, the family connections, the hospital connections, going and visiting the kids in the hospital and the families, and trying to build the trust in the hospital that will get them to come to camp sight unseen. And so that's where my passion lies. And so this past year, which was my 30th year on the job, we did a lot of soul searching and a lot of very honest discussions on how we get to the next phase. We're over $1 million in our budget now, and we've got 6 employees, and we'd like to bring in, another employee or two. And so I had the, permission through camp to say what I really felt, which was that my passion is with the families and the kids. And I'm not getting enough of that with, in a traditional CEO role. And so long story short, we're actually in the process of hiring an executive director who can take over the admin and the policy work and the board relations, the stuff that I've done, but it's always been just one of many things I'm trying to juggle. And so this will give me more time and energy to devote to the hospital outreach. We see over a dozen different hospitals, and that's very unusual for camps like us. Most of them have a partnership with 1, maybe 2 hospitals. We have 12, and we just can't keep tabs on all of them successfully. And so this is going to give me the time and the energy to get out there and start, beating the bush and bringing more families in, because we've determined that we're only serving about 1 in 10 families who could come to camp. And so part of that is because some families just are never going to be convinced that camp's a place for them. For one thing, they hear camp and think of tents. Well, we don't have tents. We used to do an outpost camping one night. We have no camps. Our tents. We have lodges with heating and air conditioning and bathrooms, and it's glamping, as some people would call it. But anyway, I get to go out there and build that trust and convince people that it is worth the time, because once we know once a new family comes, they'll never want to stay away. They'll come back forever if we let them, because it's a community unlike any other, and it's a community of kindred spirits where they not only get it, but they want to help. And if they've been through the journey, the way they make that journey mean something is that they come back and they help others through that journey. It's not a coincidence that the painting behind me, which was Tom Baker, did that painting. And it's a silhouette of someone standing on top of a mountain, helping other people up to the top of the mountain. And those are, of course, cancer survivors and families going through the struggle. And I always pictured Tom as that person at the top, kind of leading them up. And then, of course, the light in the background is the the inspiration that we draw from those who've come before us. And that could include the ones who graduated and are now healthy and in the mainstream. And that could include the kids who've passed away or, whose outcome was not favorable. But either way, we're all headed toward that same inspiration and that spirit that guides us forward. And, I think frankly that's no greater legacy than to build a perpetuating organization that keeps helping more people, and those people help more people, and so on. And so, in a nutshell, it's kind of what life is, but we're doing it in a very specific way. And so I'm going to get to spend more time on doing that part of it. And I'm very excited about that.
Amazing. Very, very exciting. And that's so interesting that, I think after we go through something and after we see something on the other side, it's like, well, of course, why wouldn't everybody want this? But I see what it must be like for people who don't understand what the opportunity is. And so I love that you're going to be spending more time at the hospitals and outreach with people at the grassroots level and the families, and to build that trust and get more kids involved. Curiosity, though, from a standpoint of more kids means more finances needed. So is there also a ramp up for the fundraising? Is there any way that if anybody is listening and inspired that we can help? What are some of the needs of Special Up?
Well, I would make a joke about not wanting your money, but that's crazy. Well, of course, as we grow, we're obviously going to have more need for funding, but that's something that I'll also still have a hand in, because I do enjoy going, for instance, to major events and meeting people and thanking them. And I love the human connection part. I'm not so good at the strategy and the drafting appeal letters and so on, but I will still be a part of the outreach for that to make sure that donors feel as engaged and invested, and frankly, find a return on their investment, because donors basically are just investors who are investing in good works rather than profit. So I look forward to continuing to be a part of the outreach in that respect as well. But we will, as we continue to get bigger, if we build it, they will come and we will pay for it. Now, Special Love also provides financial support in two ways. We give young adults who have graduated from camp the chance to go pursue college degrees or other post-secondary education by providing them with grant funding. And we also give families who are going through the cancer crisis money to pay for utilities or essential services so that, for instance, they're not in danger of being evicted in the middle of their child's treatment.
Awesome. And you have you guys have an Adopt a Camper program, don't you?
We do. We have camp scholarships where you can basically sponsor a child to go to the week of camp. Or, as I said, we do over 14 programs now. And so a lot of them are weekend camps, and you can sponsor campers to weekends. We've had companies that come in and sponsor the entire weekend. So when we do, for instance, our Oktoberfest weekend is October, no doubt. And it's a reunion for the kids who've been to the summer camps, and they want to bring their parents and introduce their parents to the organization and so on. And so we've had groups that sponsor that entire weekend. But anyway, our website is full of opportunity both to volunteer, because most of our staffing is volunteer, as well as helping through either spreading the word to other families or funding.
Awesome. I love it. So before we wrap up, is there anything, you're speaking to a whole bunch of business owners, you're speaking to people who believe in the power of positivity, not just in words, but actually in embracing that and shifting things, and also maybe interested in supporting the cause, may not, it's fine. But in any case, is there any kind of last words of wisdom or anything you'd like to share to my listeners in parting?
Sure. I think to me, it's more important that you invest in something beyond yourself. Obviously, your business is important, and you need your business to be successful, because frankly, if it's not successful, then there won't be anything to share. But I do think that, supporting charity or getting actively involved in charity is a great way to keep it connected to your human side. We do have opportunities for corporate sponsors to actually bring employees to camp or bring them to a special event. And it's a good staff bonding experience, because frankly, I think when you're all supposed to be doing, a team building your company, but when you're out there helping those less fortunate or those facing tough times like cancer, it does bring you together, and it's a great staff bonding experience. Plus, I think that, any corporate, responsible corporate philanthropist knows that investing in your community is a great way to show your investors that you care and that you're going to be around for the long haul. You're not just out for a quick buck and you're going to hit the road. So, no, I think, again, it's more important that your listeners or entrepreneurs everywhere are still keeping a hand in the human side of things, because otherwise I think it's too easy to jump on that treadmill that says, more money all the time. Or you might compare it to leaning your ladder against the wrong wall. I think it's one thing to climb the corporate ladder, but when you find that it's leaning against the wrong wall, then you're kind of in trouble. So keeping your hand on the human side, I think, is a good way to make sure that the ladder is leaning the right way.
Awesome. And any final words about just the inspiration of Camp Fantastic? Any final thoughts to leave about legacy or anything that comes up? Well,
I think you started off the talk with it by, it sometimes may sound a little snarky to talk about letting your hair down when you talk about kids with cancer, because some of them are on chemotherapy and they have no hair. But it's a fit analogy, because I think that when they come to camp, in fact, if I can figure out a way, I'll send you a picture of me last year at camp with my head shaved and a group of 3 other counselors who shaved their heads with me. But more importantly, to my left in that photo is a little girl who has no hair because of her chemotherapy. And while she was at camp, she would not take her scarf off for the first 5 days of camp because she was embarrassed by not having hair. And it wasn't until she was helping shave my head for this head shaving where we wanted to show support that she leaned over and whispered to me, "When I'm finished shaving your head, can I take my scarf off so we can get a picture together?" And of course I said, "Absolutely." And so we came out with just the best photograph of all of us, just proud and bald. And she was never happier than that moment at camp. And so when we talk about letting your hair down, we mean it. You may not have hair, but you may be hiding that fact, or you may have come to camp with a prosthetic device, an artificial limb. And it's just, to me, heartwarming and really the purpose of camp to see kids who take their scars off or take that limb off and feel free to be themselves, because they're not going to be judged, and they discover that, bald is beautiful. And there are kids there. Almost every kid who's been there has at some point been bald. And most of them now have grown their hair back. And that in itself is an inspiration. So the kids aren't afraid to show they're bald because they know that everyone else has been there, and they know that everyone else has gotten through it, and they're going to get through it.
I love it. Thank you so much, Dave, for being here. And if folks want to continue the conversation and connect, your website is?
It's speciallove.org. And there's one L, just like our logo, specialove.org. And our Facebook page is just Special Love Camps, again with one L. And our YouTube channel is Special Love Camps.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole.
And there you have it. If you enjoyed this episode of the Business Building Rockstars Show, be sure to subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss a thing. And visit bbrshow.com for all the show notes and links to resources discussed on today's show. Plus, lots more.